Thanks to all of you for coming, and Natalie as well. Even though we're all in different places, we can all be together at this Linnean Society lecture, which is really great. So I'm really excited tonight to introduce our speaker, Dr. Nathalie Pettorelli, who's a senior research fellow at the Institute of Zoology in the Zoological Society of London. And Natalie has had the most amazing career. I mean, she's done all kinds of absolutely fascinating things. And she currently heads up the Environmental Monitoring and Conservation Modeling team, which looks at tools and methodologies to support the sustainable development of natural resources. And she looks at predicting the impacts of global environmental change on biodiversity and ecosystem services, and she particularly focuses on climate change. But I also want to highlight something that I've known Natalie for many years, and that is the events called Soapbox Science, for which she received an award from the Royal Society, a Points of Light award, which sounds amazing. It's like kind of having lasers in your hair. But and this is something where scientists get up on a soapbox, and I first did this in Hyde Park Corner many years ago, and it is really, really fun. So when we all finish this pandemic, and there's another Soapbox Science, wherever you are tonight, please go along and participate, because it's a wonderful way to talk to scientists about the things that they find exciting and to start really interesting conversations which allow you to influence the way in which scientists do their science. It often seems like that's not possible, but it's certainly possible given the Soapbox Science experience. So Natalie tonight will talk to us about climate change and its impact on biodiversity. And I'm really excited to hear her speak. And I'd just like to remind everyone who's in the audience, who's not a fellow of the Linnean Society, that the Society is a place for anyone who is interested in natural history. And that includes things like climate change and biodiversity. And so if you aren't a fellow, please consider becoming a fellow. Write to our executive secretary or any one of our staff. And we welcome people who are interested in natural history, because the work that we do and the work that we're involved in spans a huge range. So with that, Natalie, I'm passing over to you. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Sandy. Thank you all for coming tonight at 6 p.m. On a Thursday evening. I'm really grateful. So today I'm going to talk to you about what I do, which is using technology to try to understand better how global environmental change, so change such as climate change, is impacting biodiversity, ecosystem services, so the service we get from nature, and how we can use this information to develop a solution. So, I mean, it's an obvious thing that our climate is currently changing. It's changing fast. It's changing faster than we thought it would a decade ago. We are having more extreme natural events. Our average temperature is going up. We see changes in season, changes in disturbance such as fires. We see sea rising. And if we are looking at what this means for a country like the UK, we just have to look at the latest prediction by the Met Office, which were released last year. And so climate change for a country like the UK means wetter winter, drier summer, and hotter summer, and hotter in general within the country, but particularly in the south part of it. It also means a change in sea level rise. And it's quite interesting to see how much the sea will be going up in less than in less than 100 years. So this is again the prediction by the Met Office that looks at the best and worst scenario and at the difference between the 80s, between 2000 and 2100. And as you can see, it's around optimistically around 60 centimeter up, but it can go to over more than a meter. And what's interesting is that this is not, it's not the same for all the coastline. Depending on where you are, that change in sea height can really be different. So at the same time as we are seeing a change in climate in our climate, we also face an unprecedented biodiversity crisis. So here, I mean, the latest numbers show an increase in the number of taxa classified as endangered or threatened in general. You see the number of extinction that is going up. You see any kind of index that we have that currently gives us an idea about our level of biodiversity roughly going down. Now, what's interesting here is that those two crises are linked. We know that climate change is impacting the biodiversity through change in distribution and extinction risk. It's impacting the risk of collapse of various ecosystems. But at the same time, that biodiversity loss means that we are losing or having degrading ecosystem services, such as carbon sequestration or climate regulation, which makes the climate change crisis even worse. And so what I'm interested here is to fill the gap, because although we know that those two crises are linked, there's still much to be learned about how climate change is impacting biodiversity and ecosystem services, but also what are our best options for mitigation and adaptation. And so what I'm trying to do is to look at region or component of biodiversity that are less well studied or that are remote and big. And I tend to do that using satellite data. And the type of framework that I use is the classical pressure state response framework that has been adopted, for example, by the Convention on Biological Diversity. So how does that work? You look at pressure on the environment, and that can be, for example, climate change. And we know that those pressure put or impact the state of biodiversity. It can do that at multiple scale. It can do that regionally, locally, nationally, and then it can affect different components of aspect of biodiversity. So it can affect structure, function, or composition. And so the idea is to look at how this threat is affecting those different attributes at different scale. And then use this information to try to think about responses, so things that you can do, such as creating protected area or translocating species. And then look again at how these solutions may or may not work. And so I try to do all of this using satellite data. So you may wonder why I'm using satellite data. Well, the first thing is that it provides world coverage. And it's way cheaper than trying to get people on the ground getting the same type of information at that spatial and temporal scale. Because it's world coverage and it's a methodology that is well understood, you can create reproducible information and standardized information, which is very transparent and sustainable, providing information on various aspects of the environment over decades in a comparable manner. The thing to understand with satellite, and I appreciate that not everybody would find that particularly interesting, but actually you do need to know those specificity to understand what you can do with satellite. The thing is that not all satellites are the same. So if you think about your physics lesson a long time ago, in my case at least, and you remember that electromagnetic spectrum, you remember that there is the visible light, there's the X-rays, the microwave, the infrared, the radio frequency. Well, those satellites capture information in different aspects of that electromagnetic spectrum. And they do it in two major ways. You either have passive sensors, which basically capture information that has been reflected from a natural source of light, such as the sun. So if we think about Earth and the sun emits radiation. It touches the Earth. Part of it is absorbed and part of it is reflected back to space. And those satellites capture this information, that light that is being reflected by the Earth. Active sensor, on the other side, actually have, they hold a source of energy that bumps energy, and what they capture is what coming back of what of that source. So they control what comes in and capture what comes out. Within those passive and those active sensor, you also have differences into what exactly, how exactly it's been doing. So for example, if you look at those passive sensors, some are capturing information in relatively broad band of the electromagnetic spectrum, while others, and relatively few, and that's the multispectral sensors, while others will capture information in a lot of very narrow bands that are very nearby each other. And that's what hyperspectral sensors do. Within the active sensors, you make the difference based on the type of energy that is sent to Earth and then captured back. So if it's microwave, you're talking about radar sensors, but if it's laser, that's what LiDAR sensors are doing. So all of that to say that those satellite and sensors cover different parts of the electromagnetic spectrum. And depending on the sensor and the satellite that is carrying those sensors, those bands may or may not be the same. So here, for example, it shows you what MODIS covers versus what Landsat 8 or Sentinel-2 are covering. As you can see, for example, for MODIS, you have multiple small band within, for example, the blue light, within the visible light, while something like Aster, as you can see, there's no information collected in that blue light. And why that matter is because whatever happened in those different bands tells you or enable you to characterize what you're looking at within a satellite imagery. They also have very different timeline. So some of those satellites were launched in the 70s and the 80s, such as VHRR, which provide you 30 plus year of information. Others, such as Landsat 8, for example, or the Sentinels, were only launched after 2010. So the number of years that you have to play with is also quite different. And of course, there's the problem of the spatial resolution. So not all those satellites are looking at the Earth with the same granularity. So if you think about something like a very high resolution satellite, such as Sentinel-2, the spatial resolution is 10 meters. But if you think as some of the MODIS products, you're going at 500 meters. So you can really see the difference in what you're able to see or not to see, depending on which sensor you're using. So that was a bit of a background to really understand some of the challenges that there is working with satellite data and why people are using sometime one sensor, sometime another one. But those considerations aside, I think what would be quite good is to show you examples of what you can do with it. Of course, this is there's much more than what I'll be able to talk about tonight, but hopefully those examples will provide you with an idea of the type of research that you can do that rely on those satellite data. So the typical way that people use satellite data is in the form of having a map, basically a shapefile, and introduce that in a model, and most likely in a species distribution model. So here is an example of exactly that. Some research that we did in Tibet on wild yak, where we were looking at predicting their habitat suitability, and in particular seeing whether we could predict with some form of confidence how the availability of their habitat might change with climate change. So we were working with WCS, and they had some really good information on the occurrence of wild yak. And so we combine information on climate, on topography, which is generally derived from a radar mission, on the distance to the nearest village, which in fact in this case was basically collected by people on the ground, but also distance on nearest glacier. And again, glacier is something that you can map using satellite data and therefore use within a model to try to see whether it matters for the distribution of your species. And something called NDVI, the Normalized Difference Vegetation Index, which the best way to think about this is an index of greenness. So it tells you how green what you're looking at is. And the higher this NDVI index, generally the more the forage availability. So in this case, we were able to look at where you are likely to see wild yak in Tibet. And so that's the two first top panel on the second figure on the right. And that we made the difference between the greening season and the harsh winter as the variable that shape habitat distribution for that species are very different during those two seasons. And then based on those best model, we were able to make prediction based on two different scenarios as to how climate change might impact the distribution of that species. So that's a classical example of how to use satellite data. But something that is related but is less done for the moment is that the same information can actually be used to look at vulnerability of species to climate change. And so in that situation, you're putting together information on the distribution of species with information on how something like extreme climatic events are occurring. And again, hurricanes, storms, information about drought, all of that is mostly derived from satellite information data. So here, an example of this is what we did with primates. Where we looked at the exposure of all the primate species to hurricanes and to drought. And what we were really interested in is to look at where the species that were both threatened and exposed to extreme climatic events. To try to see whether, so at the time when we were starting to look at this, there was a very little integration of information on vulnerability to climate change within the red list assessment of species. So we wanted to see whether the species that were classified, some of the species that were classified as threatened were actually threatened even more, because they were actually exposed quite a lot to those extreme natural events. And if there were, where were those species? And so what you can see here is the first three map represent for South America, Africa, and Asia, the distribution of threatened primate species. The middle three maps show you the distribution of threatened primate species that are exposed to hurricanes. And the third one shows you the distribution of threatened primate species that are exposed to drought. And that, as you can see, for example, you can see that there's a lot of threatened species that are on top of that having to deal with hurricanes in Madagascar, or a lot of threatened species in Mexico or Indonesia that on top of that have to deal with drought. And that could make them more vulnerable to extinction. But these type of approach really rely on using one map. So it's one shapefile that you intersect with something else to tell you or to predict, to get information about distribution of vulnerability. But what's really interesting with satellite data is that you have repeatability over time. So that means you have information and sometimes at the daily level on some parameters, such as this vegetation greenness, this NDVI index. And here is an example of how you can use this information to then get a better understanding of population dynamics and the effect of climate change on the dynamic of these populations. So this is an example from my first postdoc, actually, in Norway, where I was working on red deer with Atler. And when I joined the team, they were working on red deer, a species that was introduced, I believe, in the west coast of Norway, and that was spreading. And the idea or the hypothesis was it had to do with climate change, but the mechanism were not completely understood. Now, one thing that need to know with this species is that this species doesn't make it the winter on top of the mountain. So it's generally spend its winter nearby at the coast, at low altitude, and then migrate in the summer to a higher altitude. So what was known when I arrived was that the North Atlantic Oscillation, which is a big climate process that is based on a difference of pressure within the Atlantic, was controlling the type of winter that you could get in Norway. So when that North Atlantic Oscillation Index was low, you had relatively cold winter, which meant that if you're looking at the type of winter that you would get, it would be cold at low and high altitude, and you would have relatively little precipitation that would fall as snow both at low and high altitude. However, when that North Atlantic Oscillation Index was high, it created a dichotomy in terms of the type of winter that you would have at low and high altitude. So at low altitude, it was not cold enough for water to come as snow. And for those type of winter precipitation, there would be more precipitation. So you would have rain at low altitude, but at high altitude, on the contrary, all that precipitation would fall into in the form of snow, which means that you would have a snow accumulation on the top of those mountains. So why does this all matter? This matters because that red deer species is a migrating one in Norway. And red deer really thrive on young leaves, so new vegetation. So if you think about those two types of winter, if there is a relatively constant snow cover around all the altitude, then when the red deer starts its migration from low altitude, as it goes up and up, the vegetation is also growing and growing. So as the red deer continues its migration, the quality of what it's eating is slowly decreasing. But when you are in the type of winter where it's raining at the bottom and having a lot of snow on the top, as soon as your red deer starts its migration, it's basically tracking those new shoots of leaves, because there is a difference in when that start of the vegetation growth goes. And so you have the possibility for the red deer to track that start of the vegetation as it migrates up. And this is something we were able to show using that NDVI, because that NDVI gives you an idea as to when vegetation is starting to grow at different altitude and all over the study area. And so we were able to show that first there was a correlation between the vegetation, the start of the vegetation at low altitude and the start of the migration. So for red deer, and actually we were able to show that red deer started to migrate up to 20 days earlier based on when the vegetation was starting to grow at low altitude. And to relate the start of the vegetation, so that phenological change in terms of vegetation, with the NAO, the North Atlantic Oscillation, and those type of winter, which then provided a mechanism to understand what was actually going on with the red deer. So because you had those winter where basically vegetation was starting to grow earlier at low altitude, and you had that decoupling between when vegetation was starting at low and high altitude, and those winter became more common, the red deer was gaining more mass every year that that type of winter was happening. Now, this led to up to a 5 kilogram difference in the body mass of those red deer in autumn. And when you know that only 1 kilo makes a 7% increase in the proportion of female that reproduce for the first time, or a 13% increase in the proportion of female fawns that survive the winter, you can really see how the type of winter that you have and how it changed with climate change and how it's influencing the vegetation, and therefore the red deer performance is altogether driving that expansion of red deer in Norway, both in numbers but also in distribution. Now that NDVI index, that index of greenness, can be used for more than just looking at relating vegetation dynamics with species. In itself, it gives you information about ecosystem functioning and how ecosystem functioning is reacting to climate change. And this is something we did for Africa. Where we were really interested in looking at how change in climatic condition over the past, over a number of decades, was influencing the type of vegetation dynamic that you could see in Africa. Now, we knew from the prediction by the IPCC that you could expect a change in seasonality in precipitation that should lead to a change in vegetation dynamic. But here what we did was to test those predictions by looking at the vegetation dynamic in 168 protected area over the 82 to 2008 period. And for each of those protected area, we extracted information of that NDVI dynamics, that greenness dynamics. And what was really interesting was that what we found match the IPCC prediction. Namely, you could see an increased seasonality in that NDVI index. So seasonality meaning really the difference between the maximum NDVI value within a year and the minimum NDVI value within a year. So maximum greenness and minimum greenness. That difference was increasing in the south part of Africa, while in the north we couldn't really pick up anything. But at the same time, you could see a reduction in what's called the INDVI. So that's the sum of greenness over a year, which gives you an idea about net primary productivity or primary productivity over a given year. And that was going down in places such as Kenya or Namibia. And so a really powerful way to get some insight as to how climate change can affect vegetation dynamic itself, affecting species, as we have seen with, for example, the red deer example. Now, the cool things with satellite is that not only it tells you something about that greenness and how phenology in vegetation dynamics change, but it also enables you to map land cover and therefore certain community of plants. And that is a particularly interesting topic when you're looking at the Arctic, where climate change is expected to lead to the expansion of shrubs, known as shrubification. Now, why it's interesting here is because one of a number of people have put together the hypothesis that the management of livestock, particularly reindeer management in some area, could really temper or shape the response of vegetation communities to climate change. This is an example that this is a study that tested that hypothesis, looking at the Yamal Peninsula, where climate change has led to a slow rise in temperature, But at the same time, the reindeer numbers, which are on the bottom right figure C in that slide, have been really shooting up over the past few years. And so what we did here was to use satellite data to look at the distribution of tundra and shrubs and see whether this was changing over the years, to see whether you could see the shrubification that was expected by climate change or not. And so in this particular case, we couldn't find any evidence of shrubification, which supported the idea that reindeer management could actually help maintain open tundra in places such as the Yamal Peninsula, as you continue to see a change in climate. So I hope that I made a good case showing how you can use satellite information to really derive information about the ecology of specific species and relate that to the dynamics or the changing structure of the ecosystem or within their habitat. And so therefore, if you take that as something that you can do, you can reverse it backwards and start to use the information and your understanding to try to plan for conservation actions such as reintroduction. And this is something that we did here to help or support research toward a reintroduction project in Chad of the scimitar oryx, a very large ungulate, one of the few megafauna which is not doing super well in the Sahara. And that conservation project was about bringing them back in a country where they used to be very abundant. Now, when you do a reintroduction project, the first thing to acknowledge is that it costs a hell of money. So you want to really be sure that you're using wisely your money by bringing back species in habitats that they have a good chance of making it. Now, the last time the scimitar oryx was the last time that the scimitar oryx was found in the reserve where the reintroduction was planned was in the 80s. And as you can imagine, the climate change might have changed the distribution of habitat for that species. And so that study in that paper was exactly trying to look at that. So it was looking at the change in habitat since the 80s in the reserve where the reintroduction was planned, to see to which extent the habitat as it was now could be comparable or was as likely to support that reintroduction project. So what we did here was to use again that index of greenness, that's NDVI, and look at change over time in 4 parameters. The first one is that INDVI, which is again an annual, give you an information about the annual greenness in a given area. This RREL, which is basically the level of seasonality, which is based on this maximum NDVI minus the minimum value of NDVI. So I've done a little curve on the bottom right to explain how you derive that within a curve, within an area for a given system. And then the minimum NDVI and maximum NDVI. So minimum NDVI being the minimum value that greenness index take each year, and maximum being the maximum value. And then what we did was to look for significant trend in those 4 variables. So to see where was there any significant change in any of these parameters. And so what you could see here is that, so dark green is a significant positive change. Dark brown is significant decrease in the parameter. So what you could see if we start with this maximum NDVI is that the maximum value that the NDVI would take in a year has been slowly increasing in the south of that game reserve. But at the same time, that maximum value has been significantly decreasing in the north of the reserve. And that's because this reserve actually sits just at the border between the Sahel and the true desert. And so what it means that basically over that 30 years or so, 20 plus years, the north of the reserve has become more deserted, while the south has become much more green. And that's why you have, for example, a significant increase in the level of seasonality in the south. The difference between the minimum and maximum has been increasing significantly in the south. And so why is this interesting at all when we're talking about the reintroduction of that species? Well, that species actually love the border between the deserts and the south. It likes that ecotone. And the problem is that with climate change, that favorite habitat has been slowly being really contracted. And so in itself, it doesn't prevent the reintroduction or should stop the project, but it's a really important aspect to take into consideration when you're thinking, for example, about maximum capacity for that species in that area or management intervention. And actually, to follow up on that example, here is another study that we did exactly in the same place, and that was a follow-up to that first study. Now, I've just said in the previous paragraph, I just go back, that the south of the reserve has become greener, and the maximum level of greenness has increased over time. The seasonality has increased. So what has happened is that actually it has attracted people with livestock because they've become greener. And what has happened is that people have started to dig artificial waterhole to provide water for their livestock. Now, what you see here, the picture on the bottom right, is an artificial waterhole, but seen from space. And all those little lines are lines left by livestock as they go in and out of the waterhole. Again, why does this matter? Well, then first you can see what a waterhole does to locally to the ecosystem, because it leads to degradation. But also, waterhole can be a zone of tension between livestock and wildlife. And so wildlife may avoid it, etc., etc. Now, the problem that we had here is that this is a relatively remote area, and nobody really had an idea about the number of waterholes. We knew that people were putting waterhole. We knew that it could create degradation, but we didn't really know to the extent to which those how many waterholes were happening in that reserve. And here we used, again, satellite data to develop an algorithm to map them. And we ended up with over 120 points, and that was 5 years ago. It might be more now. Mostly occurring in the south of the reserve, as you can see on the bottom left of the image. The accuracy was 92%, so a pretty good way to detect them from space. Again, this can have an impact for your reintroduction program, because it may create conflict or tension between livestock owner and pastoralist, and people trying to promote the viability of that newly reintroduced scimitar oryx population. So here, really a good example of how to use satellite data to detect change in human behavior that eventually lead to change in ecosystem functioning. Now, I've spent a lot of time talking about what was happening in terrestrial environment and not really talking about sea rise, but I really wanted to put 2 or 3 examples of what you can do with satellite data to really look at the management of coastal ecosystem. So I started to work on this early mid-2000 when we had a program working on tigers in Bangladesh. And they just had a big storm, and they asked whether we could use satellite information to give them some data about the level of damage that storm had done in the area where they were working, because they were really concerned about habitat degradation and potential impact on tigers. But actually that study led to a completely different story. Because as soon as we started to look at the data, what we noticed wasn't that much the degradation or the damage done by the hurricane, but really the coastal recession. And we were completely amazed to see how within 2 years, up to 170 meters of coast had just disappeared. And that really started to create a discussion about the rapidity at which sea rise was happening, and to which extent some of the coastal ecosystem were changing quite dramatically in terms of distribution. I'm really happy to see that nowadays more studies have been done on this, and indeed we are seeing sea rise at a much faster rate than what was expected at that time. Now, the cool stuff with satellite data and coastal systems such as mangrove ecosystem is that satellite data really give you this unique possibility to look at ecosystem both in terms of resilience and resistance to a threat such as a sea level rise. And this was really nicely demonstrated by Claire Duncan, who used to do her PhD and now is a full-fledged researcher on mangrove ecosystem. And here she demonstrated how you could use information from different sensors to look at how vulnerable those mangrove could be. So she here used 7 different mangrove, big mangrove that are known both in Africa and Asia, and looked at a way to comparatively, but in a standardized manner, assess their vulnerability to sea level rise. So I'm not going to spend time as to trying to read all of this chart, but what's really interesting is that she combined different sensors. So as you remember at the beginning of this talk, I was saying that not all satellites are the same. But that can be a problem. It can also be a strength, because then you can combine different information to access different data about aspects that you're particularly concerned in. And in her case, when she was looking at resilience, what she was interested in was at the ability for mangrove to move landward as sea was slowly rising. But when she was looking at something like resistance, she was much more interested in biomass. So looking at the ability to continue to function normally. And then she combined that with information on topographic constraint, because as soon as the slopes start to increase, your mangrove cannot really move landward, as well as potential change in sediment availability and anthropogenic development. So all of that using information, satellite information, to then come up with really a system that allow you to prioritize action for conservation of mangrove, those big mangroves. Given what we know about their ability, their capacity for resilience and resistance, their ability to adapt to change and to continue to work in the face of changing environmental condition, enabling, for example, in this case, to really shed the light on a mangrove in Tanzania, where all the indicators, so capacity for resilience, resistance, potential change in anthropogenic factors, as well as sediment, everything was in the red. So all of that with satellite data. So I'll stop with the example and the traveling from one place to another. What I want to say is that there's many more applications than what I've just been talking about. Satellite data enable you to, for example, explore how climate change might affect disturbance dynamic. Whether you're looking at fires, at floods, or algal blooms. It also allows you to start to think about interaction between different threats. So, for example, climate change and invasive species, because with certain sensors, such as a hyperspectral, we can actually detect invasive species spread, and therefore look at the spread of those species with climate change. Or you can think about the interaction between land use change and climate change, which one of my PhD students, Henrike Schulte-Bühne, is doing right now, and looking at how those interactions are shaping biodiversity and ecosystem services. And then you can also start to think about ecosystem collapse risk and how climate change is affecting that. Now, the red list of ecosystem has really highlighted the role of satellite data for those ecosystem assessments. But then it then provide a pathway for starting to look at how you can compare the risk of different collapse for different ecosystems based on exposure to various threat linked to climate change. And then there's much more algorithms. So everything that I've shown you and that we've been doing, we've done it one way, but there's multiple ways to do that. And that's because the computing power is changing. Algorithms are evolving quite fast. And there's really a good possibility to now merge data from different sensors to improve your ability, for example, to map land cover and fusion in particular. So this ability to those different way to bring together information from different sensors to improve your ability to derive information that is ecological relevant, I think is the next big thing in terms of satellite remote sensing for conservation. And then there's many more technologies. So satellite remote sensing is part of an increasing trend toward using technology to inform conservation. And we see very much parallel in terms of development in UAVs and drones, the availability of aerial data in general, camera traps, bioacoustics, eDNA, and then all the citizen science and, and the apps that represent a change in how we are collecting information, but also represent a really good opportunity to integrate information at different scales from different technology. So what's my take-home message? We're nearly there, people. So I hope that I've kind of managed to convince you that satellite data provide a fantastic opportunity to monitor change in a habitat or ecosystem distribution, composition, structure, and functioning in really difficult or remote places, places where conservation is particularly needed. It also provides a measure of change that you can then link to entities that you may be more familiar, such as species, such as behavior, such as life history trait. So really providing a way to get at the mechanism by which a population or a species is changing in dynamic and extinction risk, etc. But the main thing is that satellite data is no replacement to classical ground-based data. It's simply not comparable, the type of information that you get. Now, they shouldn't be replacement, but neither should they be thought as one is better than the other. What actually they are is that they are very complementary. So the best results, the ecological, the progress in ecological understanding is best achieved when you're combining and integrating those different sources of information. And then it's the second home. The main message also is that things are really changing very fast in that sphere. And we're only starting to capitalize on this opportunity. There's new sensors coming, a new mission launched. We are now having finally access to a satellite LiDAR data, which will, I believe, transform what we can do in terms of understanding how the 3D structure of ecosystem is influencing other aspects of biodiversity. There's a new product. So for each information that a satellite capture, you can derive different products, and those products are becoming better and better all the time. And then the advance in big data and computing power and in algorithm and platform to support it is also huge and big, which means that we are really seeing a rapid change, and it can be quite tough to keep up with and the literature and the pace at which it's going, but it's also opening some incredible opportunity to learn more and do more. But all of that relies on data accessibility. And it can't be stated enough that all those gain in knowledge, all those advances that can support conservation are basically completely underpinned by availability of free data. And here, just for an example, I just put a figure that illustrates the number of downloads of Landsat data before and after they open up their archives for free. And they opened up in 2008. And as you can see, as soon as they opened, the number of views and the number of downloads went up the roof. There's a real need for different disciplines, including ecology, to really engage in any debate that puts at risk this availability of free data. I hope also that this talk highlight the increased importance of technology in conservation, and therefore highlight the importance of interdisciplinary training. You simply can't ask people that have not heard anything about satellite after their PhD to suddenly rush and use this golden opportunity to advance their research. You need to think way before. And so this silo approach to scientific disciplines and need to stop somehow. We do need to think about programs that integrate much more disciplines such as geography, such as physics, and such as biology, to really prepare the next generation to be able to capture and capitalize on this incredible opportunity. And then finally, I hope that this will also highlight the importance of a different community, but the Earth observation community and the wildlife management community in particular, to work more together. They tend to be in different, attend different conference, read different journal, do different things, and that doesn't help build those collaboration that will be so pertinent when it comes to advancing tools and methods that avoid conservation money to be wasted. And that's all for me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nathalie. That was absolutely fascinating. And I loved your plea for open science and interdisciplinary science. I mean, I think that's really something that's a theme of the age, isn't it? We've all benefited so much from having data openly available during this pandemic. We have a couple of questions which have come through. One from Rachel Cooper-Bohannon she's asked, is the frequency of dryness data from WorldClim? And I think she's referring to your red deer study.
Yeah, the red deer. So the red deer study wasn't using the BioClim data. It was using primarily information on the North Atlantic oscillation, which is a difference of pressure between the Azores and Iceland.
I think that's what it's referring to, but I'm not absolutely sure because it just says, is the frequency of dryness data from WorldClim, but it came around the time that you were talking about the red deer.
It might be because of the primate data. So we used an index of droughtness, which is the SPI. There's different way to measure drought. And actually, as something we're exploring right now, which is how does the choice of which data you use influence or not potentially the outcome. But yeah, there's different way. I think we use the SPI on this one. Yeah.
So one of the things that I'd like to ask is about ground truthing data, and is it possible? Well, I'm sure it's possible, but how much more difficult is it if there isn't ground truthing that goes with the satellite data? How much more difficult?
It's not. I mean, that's a misconception by a lot of people. They think that if you have to do satellite data, you need to have all the ground truthing. But if you had all that incredible ground truthing, then why would you use satellite data? So there's a lot of things that have been established around the world and that we're pretty sure about, like that the NDVI is a good proxy for net primary productivity. So it's great if you have them, and it helps refine or make develop more informed classification, for example.
Mhm.
But you can do, and in the case, in the example that I presented, that's a lot of it was based on that. But you can use other data than ground-based data to validate, for example, your land cover classification. So if you, I'm sure all of you have been playing with Google Earth. Google Earth is a collection of very, very high detail information and maps about your area, where the trees are, etc. And that kind of information can be used to train land cover classification of satellite data such as Landsat or Sentinel. So you can do stuff without ground-based information. It's always better when you have ground-based information because it's more precise. But when you're working in a very remote environment that is very large scale and there's just no way you will get all this information, then you can still do a lot of cool stuff.
So are there types of habitats and biomes where it's better or worse?
It depends on what you do, because satellite can do a lot of stuff. Yeah, so you can map urbanization, you can look at hurricanes, you can get. So the general point maybe that might be good to know is that when you're using those optical, so remember I had a slide about the different type of satellite and the passive versus active, and the passive one used basically they collect information on the reflected light by the Earth from the sun. Yeah. So all of those satellites, because they are passive, but also because of the way they are working, they are sensitive to clouds. So as soon as you're clouds, what you get is picture of clouds. So some of those satellites, so all those optical satellites, those satellites such as Landsat and MODIS, are very sensitive to cloud cover, so they might not work super well in, for example, the Solomon Island, where I did a BSc project with a student, and she had picture with up to 80% or 90%, and she couldn't find one image that just had no cloud. But then what's really cool again is that you have technology such as radar, which is a different type of satellite sensor. And those one actually, they don't care about clouds. So you wouldn't be able to have information on something like the NDVI because the NDVI rely on information that is captured in the visible light and therefore is sensitive to cloud. But something on 3D structure, for example, anything that use information as within the 3D, radar is pretty good at doing that. And can do it even when there's cloud.
So if you were a student, so here's a question from Kamal Ramasoi. Can satellite data be used to assess range shifts in the UK that are expected to occur as a result of a rise in temperature?
Yes, so you can use a satellite to monitor precipitation. But in a country like the UK, you're better off using the weather station because they provide more robust and more detailed information. So the key with understanding the role of satellite is that if you have information on the ground, don't bother with the satellite. If you can do it with something that is well monitored, and the UK is super well monitored. I mean, you have the number of people that are providing information on this country is humongous. So it's reduced. But if you're working in an area where there's no weather station, and in many parts of Africa it's much more difficult, then you switch to something like satellite.
So I have a question.
We have, Padma, you go ahead and ask yours and then I'll ask mine at the end.
Sure. I was wondering, a lot of conservationists are starting to use footage from drones. And I was wondering if that kind of fills a middle ground somewhere between satellite and ground truthing, at least for smaller projects. Or
Absolutely. I mean, the difference, so again, those technology are meant to be complementary. But there's things that the drone doesn't do, right? If you want to know what's happening over the past 10 years, it's not a drone. If you're working in an area where you don't have the right to fly the drone because of military constraints, then you can't use drone. If you want, if you have a very reduced budget, you can't do drones. So drones are very good for seeing at a much sharper resolution. Yeah, you have all those famous example of counting seals or looking at orangutan nest with drones. It's something that the satellite will not do. But if you are looking at a different type of question that needs information on long time scale, then you switch also to satellite. So it's not just about the spatial resolution, it's also about the temporal coverage. And it's also about whether you actually can use that technology or not.
Yeah, that's really interesting, is we get things to fill in the gaps all the time. So I know that we have students who look at our at the recordings of these on our YouTube channel. So just before you have to go, I'd just like to ask you, if you were an A-level student or someone who was wanting to go into this kind of work now, what kinds of things should you kind of make sure that are in your portfolio of expertise, or things that to make yourself into an interdisciplinary science in the way that you are, Nathalie?
Well, I wasn't trained like that, which is why I always make the plea. Because
Well, exactly.
it would have saved me. It would have saved me a lot of things. I think stay general. I mean, I know that is not a popular message, and we do need our specialists in a lot of different ways, but not at the expense of losing the generalist. And so if you want to do interdisciplinary work, which this builds into, you need to be able to understand concepts in different community, which means you need to read and engage with those communities. And so if you're specifically interested in remote sensing, I think that you need some connection with geography, where a lot of those techniques are developed and evolved, where there's discussion as to how to interpret this information, understanding the constraint, correct for the different bias. So, and then you need some connection with coding, one way or another. So understanding how to use different platforms to develop loops that means that it will eventually converge somewhere, or your laptop will not just explode. So those different disciplines. But the thing is that what's really fun with interdisciplinarity is that you never know which discipline you'll next get interested in. And so I think I don't know whether there's a recipe to be ready for whatever life will be throwing at you, but remain curious and read outside the box is what prepare you the best for this.
I think also that's a really good advice, I think, for anybody who's listening to this in the future, is that remain open. And I think one of the things that's important is actually knowing about natural history, which is what the society is all about.
Well, as you've seen in that talk, the information without question and context is nothing. And that's what natural history provides you with the tools to understand the mechanism that shapes ecology. So yeah, well, you can't do without it.
We can't do without it. And that's what the society is all about. So people who aren't fellows, please consider joining the society. And Nathalie, thank you very much for an illuminating lecture and a fantastic run through the possibilities with Earth observation. So thanks so much. And I hope everyone has a very nice rest of their evening. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.